providing yeast, you are always, cleaning your intestine of Salmonella, E. coli, and mitigating problems, eventual problems with mycotoxins.
Hello and welcome to the Pet Food Science Podcast, where our goal is to share research findings to help support the continual innovation in the pet food and nutrition industry. I'm your host, Dr. 𝗪𝗀𝗃𝗍𝗃, and I'm here today with today's guest, Glycon Santos, Chief Executive Officer of 𝗍𝗫𝗃, an international ingredient company with a mission to adding value to the nutrition that we provide to our animals. Welcome, Glycon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I'm really excited to chat with you today about your products in yeast. And I thought maybe I could first start by introducing you to the audience. Glycon Santos was born and raised in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He has a bachelor's degree in engineering from Mackenzie University and a bachelor's in business from the University of Sao Paulo. Glycon founded 𝗍𝗫𝗃 in 1992, growing it to become one of the world's leaders in the production of yeast additives with the export to more than 70 countries. His legacy is the transformation of yeast generated during sugarcane ethanol fermentation into different technical or technological additives based on that yeast. Well, Glycon, I thought maybe we could start with you reminding the listeners what the characteristics of yeast and their components are.
Well, okay. Yeast is a fungi, and it's 𝗪𝗀𝗃𝗁𝘀𝘁𝗀𝘃. It's a species, and it's the same as the baker's yeast, the brewer's yeast. So it's basically the same yeast, and it is used in order to transform sugars in alcohol. So on the alcoholic fermentation. And if you provide a lot of oxygen, the yeast will only produce biomass. The yeast is very interesting because it's a cell wall. It's made of beta-glucans that have an action modulating the innate immune system. The beta-glucans are also very good to mitigate mycotoxin contamination in the feeds because it's very effective against non-polar mycotoxins. And the yeast cell wall is also made of monoligosaccharides that have the ability to bind to the fimbriae present on Salmonella and E. coli and drag these pathogens out of the intestine. The yeast is also very rich in nucleic acids, and if you do the right process on alkalizing the yeast and then hydrolyzing these nucleic acids, it becomes a source of free nucleotides and nucleosides, which are very important in order to speed up the production of new cells. So for animals in reproduction, for young animals or sick animals, this can be very good. The yeast it's a protein source. That's not the main reason that it's used, but it's rich in protein. It has a 40% protein level typically, and the amino acid profile is very good, ideal for the animal nutrition. And the yeast is the richest natural source of the B vitamins, which are very important on the synthesis of new proteins. So the yeast it's a very complex and rich ingredient. And then people usually explore different elements of in present on this yeast. Some put more focus on the mycotoxin mitigation, others on immune modulation, others on intestinal health, others on the properties to enhance growth because of the nucleotides. So it's but it's all there. It's all there.
𝗍𝗫𝗃 Animal Nutrition, a Brazilian company with 30 years of history and present in more than 70 different countries, providing natural, sustainable, and technological solutions for animal nutrition, health, and well-being in a safe and scientific way. adding value in food production and helping to feed the world.
Yeah, yeast is an extraordinarily fascinating product and should be included in almost all feeds and foods for that matter, if we talk about pets. I see a really strong application to the value of yeast as well as a supplement. Do you have any comments maybe about, rather than its inclusion in the diets of animals, whether you think that yeast and yeast products will become supplementary or supplements available to the pet food consumer for things like when they're going to be transported somewhere. So thinking about the application of probiotics in general, and now I'm talking a little bit more about yeast, live yeast as a probiotic, but there are also other applications of yeast and yeast cell components that would definitely have immunoboosting effects for times when dogs or cats may experience either mental or physical stress. So there might be an opportunity for supplements. Do you think there may be?
No, definitely. Whenever there is a stressful situation, it can be the transportation of animals to other places. It can be, the traveling of the caregivers of these dogs and cats. It can be, weather patterns, extremely hot weather, whatever causes you stress. One of the first effects that you're going to feel is on your digestive system. And you can have a higher challenge on your immune system, and so having yeast on your diet or having yeast as a supplement will guarantee that you keep your baseline at a certain level that makes your immune system to work better, faster. And there is several trials published either by ICC or by all our competitors showing this effect. And the other effect is that if you have any kind of unsettling of your environment, usually the first thing that will suffer is your intestine. And by providing yeast, you are always cleaning your intestine of Salmonella, E.coli, and mitigating eventual problems with mycotoxins. So it is a good strategy to use yeast as a supplement, because then you can increase the dosage, because you're not going to force feed any animal. So typically the yeast is already present on your population. But for example, I take yeast every day for several years before I start working with yeast. In my family, my mother always gave yeast to everyone. And it's incredible the effect on your intestinal system. Like I see people, I travel many times to Asia and India, and typically our clients, none of our clients will be like in New York City. They will be, so you fly to a big city and then you drive several hours, and you have to eat in this, roadside restaurants, whatever, kind of food that you can find. And it's incredible the effect of the yeast on your intestine, on providing that baseline that will keep you going healthy and unsettled.
Yeah, great story, Glycon, in terms of, kind of that baseline and having that foundation in the food that you eat that will then support your ability to mount an immune response. And that's very different than ensuring nutrient surfeit, as an example. Yeast is not acting solely as a nutrient. It also has all these components that help to signal the immune system and allow you to have a better response. And when I say you, every terrestrial animal that's been investigated in, yeast is a beneficial additive or ingredient or food additive that would help you. I think the really important thing that you point out there is that you don't just need to use yeast when you're experiencing a stress, but if yeast is there along the whole way, not only will it not be of detriment to the animal or the human for that matter, but it will allow the system to respond. And that maybe if you know you're going to be going under more stress than usual, there might be a case to increase that dose. And so that really speaks to yeast products should be considered not just for foods, but for supplements. So you can kind of adjust that dose. It's a really fascinating approach to really immune support, shall we say, and frankly, not just immune support, but it is also support for gut health. And of course, our gut health underpins our ability to digest and absorb nutrients, no matter what mammal we are. So you can have yeast there all the time. Are there any other aspects of yeast that pet food companies might consider that might be a benefit to the performance of their products, either under the eyes of a veterinarian in terms of looking at health, or something that a consumer might notice when they're feeding products that contain yeast to their dogs or cats?
When consumers are feeding yeast, they will notice, better shiny hair, and they will notice a better quality of the feces. That's what it's going to be noticed, and it's noticed because it's not only that the yeast is providing some important nutrients like B vitamins, nice protein, and nucleic acids, many times in forms of free nucleotides. Is that the yeast guarantees that your intestine will function better. It protects the intestine, and it especially the tight junctions, because the yeast. It's kind of one way to look at it. It's to look at it not as a probiotic or a prebiotic, but much more as a functional fiber. That's the point, because the yeast is the beta-glucans and monoligosaccharides of the yeast are undigestible, and they will carry pathogens and mycotoxins out of the gut. So it's much the real way of working off a yeast is much. It's as a functional fiber, cleaning the intestine. And if you have a healthy intestine, you have a better absorption of nutrients.
Yep. Exactly.
And so for many years, like when I started to work with yeast, everybody was saying, yeah, yeast has UGF, unknown growth factors. And that's it. Yeast, it's UGF. And the point that makes it very difficult to understand the yeast, and I think that this it has still today a pushback against the yeast. It's that the yeast is a food ingredient. Yeast is not a chemical. Yeast is not a isolated component. So if you look at a yeast, it's a food ingredient. And the problem is that, as I said on the introduction, it's made of beta-glucans that are very efficient modulating the innate immune system, that is very efficient mitigating mycotoxin problems. It's a source of monoligosaccharides, which is very efficient carrying pathogens out of the intestine. It is a source of nucleic acids. It's a source of B vitamins. It's a source of protein. And then it's very difficult that you make a scientific trial and you can isolate one factor. So you have people that fall in love by the immune modulation properties of the yeast. Other people fall in love by the pathogen binding. The other people by the mycotoxin mitigation, and they are talking about the same product, and this creates like a pushback, like, hey, it's too much, for the same product. But it is a food item, and so there is no concern about, okay, am I overdosing? That's almost impossible to overdose on yeast. But it's just like, oh, what happens if I eat 1 apple or 3 apples a day? Pretty much the same, you know. It's not a risk because it's a food ingredient, but it's a food ingredient that provides all these elements that each of them has a very important and specific way of helping on intestinal health and the absorption of nutrients and providing specific nutrients as well. So it's, I think that it's not a silver bullet, but yeast can, we are in a world where the challenge is to replace the antibiotics. So how we are going to do that? Because the antibiotics used to be the miracle element, resolving all our problems, but not anymore because, resistance was created by the overuse of the antibiotics, and we will not have a silver bullet to replace the antibiotics. So we are going to have to build up a strategy, and there's a strategy. It's not only by finding a new product, but also by providing our food on a different way, by taking care of the environment. But the yeast will be a part of the solution. We'll build together with other elements. It's going to be building the solution for us to be able to get rid of the use of antibiotics in the feed.
Yeah, I agree. So maybe to summarize a little bit for the listeners, yeast and its products, and this is broadly across the entire industry. We're going to get into some points about products in a second. But yeast and yeast products provide prebiotics. They provide nutrients, especially in the form of amino acids and vitamins. They are a source of nucleotides, which are very important, especially for growth. And the prebiotics that are included in yeast are both immunostimulatory based on cell signaling, but also provide gastrointestinal benefits because they reduce the pathogenic bacterial burden on the animal. So in concert, and I should say that, of all of those things, yeast can not only provide immunostimulating effects and gut health benefits, but will also improve the digestibility or bioavailability of quite a few of the nutrients in the diet. So if you include yeast in your products, you may also get improved digestive efficiency as well. We talk about that a lot in agricultural animal nutrition, but we don't talk about digestive efficiency very much in pet food nutrition. And I think the time will come, especially as sustainability is becoming more important. We have to start thinking about how to reduce the impact of our companion animals, the burden of our companion animals on the environment as well. So I think that there will be a component there that yeast can also address. But now that we've kind of summarized the characteristics of yeast, why you might apply them to pet food, and what those benefits that veterinary professionals and the pet consumer might see, what is different between the product that you are producing in Brazil, which is you use yeast in sugarcane ethanol fermentation. And the first thing I thought about is, of course, this must be very close to the use of yeast in corn fermentation for ethanol production in the United States. So maybe let's start with just contrasting how DDGS, as an example, may differ from, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to actually tell me what the product sugar cane distillers, what that product is called too. I'm not as familiar with it being in the Northern Hemisphere as you are in the Southern Hemisphere. So if you could talk about those two different products and maybe just compare them for the listeners, that'd be great.
Okay, very well. So, yeah, the yeast use it on, so the baker's yeast, they use it in corn ethanol fermentation. They use it in sugarcane ethanol yeast fermentation. The yeast used in the beer fermentation, they are all the same. 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗁𝘀𝘁𝗀 yeast. Okay, so and why do we use the yeast in beer, corn ethanol fermentation, or sugarcane ethanol fermentation? We use the yeast without the presence of oxygen. It will feed itself with the sugars and transform the sugars into alcohol. Okay, so the yeast is it's a worker producing alcohol. And on the end of this fermentation, you're going to separate the wine or the beer, whatever you want to call it, and send this to a distillery. And you're going to separate your yeast, and this is a byproduct of the fermentation process. And then you're going to, process and spray dry this yeast. So when you compare a brewer's yeast, you're going to have a very pure product, and the amount of cells per gram is 20 to 25 billion cells of inactive cells of yeast, of 𝗟𝗏 𝗪𝗀𝗃 yeast per gram of product. Okay, and the product is a little bit bitter because of the use of the hops on the fermentation, and this is very good for dogs and cats. The dogs and cats, they love the bitterness. And then when you look at the sugarcane ethanol fermentation yeast, you also have a very pure product, 20-25 billion cells per gram. And then the flavor is more soft, and it's also really palatable for dogs and cats. And so brewer's yeast and sugarcane ethanol yeast are the two products that are pure. Yeah, it's pure yeast. Just like the baker's yeast, it's like 20-25 billion cells per gram. When you look at the yeast coming from the corn alcohol fermentation, then when you separate the yeast, it's unavoidable. You carry some of the corn byproducts. So when you count the cells, you're going to count 5 to 7 billion. So a yeast coming from corn fermentation typically will have 1/3 or 25% of the concentration in terms of purity as compared to a brewer's yeast, a pure brewer's yeast, or a pure sugarcane ethanol yeast. Okay, and it's important that the pet food companies know about that, because if you're formulating your pet food, your cat food with yeast, is because you believe on the properties of the yeast, but the properties will be there if the yeast is there, okay, on the right dosage. Because if you have less yeast per gram, that means that you have 25%, 30% of the yeast in a bag of yeast compared to a pure brewer's yeast. That means that you have 30% of the beta-glucans, 30% of the monoligosaccharides, or the nucleotides. So the product is not really pure. And because like 10, 20 years ago, the pet food industry started to grow significantly, and then there was a shortage of yeast in the market. Then some companies developed blends, I guess that blends of brewer's yeast with some other vegetable carriers. You are buying a bag of something that is labeled as yeast, but inside you have half yeast, 1/3, 10% yeast, and 90% of something else. So then what's the point? It's, according to my point of view, it's much better to buy a pure brewer's yeast and buy this other vegetable source wherever at a much cheaper price. And more, what we see, and this is kind of makes us worried, is that the corn ethanol companies in the United States, they are trying to position the DDGs as a yeast source, because depending on the process, you can have products that will have 10% yeast concentration on this DDG. So basically, it is a DDG product with all the negative aspects connected to the DDG, with a significant fraction of yeast, but significant meaning 5 to 10%. But then the label and the claim is that this is a yeast product, and I think that this is what the pet food companies need to be aware of. That what's the purity of the product that I am buying? And there is no doubt that the yeast is super palatable, nutritious, and functional for dogs and cats. Immune modulation, intestinal integrity, mycotoxin mitigation, special nutrients such as B vitamins and nucleotides. But what's important, if you believe on that, if you want to offer that to your consumer, is that you buy a pure yeast source, and then you will formulate according to your strategy. 1%, 2%, 5%, but of a pure product.
Yeah.
And not of either a blended product or a product that, because of where it comes from, it carries corn byproducts. But that's not the point. You can buy DDG at a super low price. That's. I think this is important concern, important thing to be checked by the industry.
Indeed. And I would add to that the further importance of ensuring that you are adding sufficient yeast is that you really need to think about whether you're going to make any claims around the addition of your yeast. And those need to be supported by understanding what the efficacious dose of the functional products of those yeast are. So like everything that we add to the diet, if it's too low, it'll be ineffective. If it's too high, there can be other detriments, and with yeast, it would be very high. We've seen quite a bit of information on the addition of yeast to pet foods and animal agricultural feeds that clearly demonstrate the benefits and the safety of yeast. But I just want to make sure that the pet food companies understand dose is important to enable you to make the claims. And the way that you make the claims is that you ensure that the pet that you are feeding actually experiences the physiological benefits of yeast, and you can only get those benefits of yeast if you include them at a sufficient dose. So everybody needs to make sure that that is happening. Don't add it at a very low inclusion level because you want to include it on your ingredient deck. You need to ensure that it's at the level that you need to convey the benefits. So I really hope that pet food companies stop putting things on their label to virtue signal, and rather they're on their label and in the position where they have demonstrated their dose is at an efficacious level. I was a little bit of a soapbox on my part there, but that was a bit of a summary of what you were saying as well.
Yes.
So 𝗫𝗍𝒄, though, has a number of specific yeast and yeast products. And I was hoping that you could walk through for our listeners what your offerings are for the pet food industry and how each one of those are different. So why you might want to choose one over another.
Well, we have purified beta-glucan and monoligosaccharides source. This is that is called 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗃. It has a very high concentration of beta-glucans and monoligosaccharides. And this is a product for very small inclusion rates if you are aiming an effect on immune modulation and intestinal health. Then we have two different products. A hydrolyzed yeast, it's our 𝗽𝗫𝘀𝗃. It's a yeast that goes through phenoltolysis, and then you use a set of very specific enzymes to degrade the nucleic acids present on the yeast into free nucleotides and nucleosides. So you have a fairly high amount of beta-glucan and monosaccharides, but the most important element is the nucleotides and nucleosides, which are the ideal form of absorption of the nucleotides in order for the animals. It facilitates the buildup of new cells by the animals. So this is especially good for very young animals and for sick animals. We have the 𝗽𝗫𝘀, which is an alkalized yeast that is a yeast with enhanced palatability. As I mentioned, the brewer's yeast is the product of choice, typically because of the bitterness. It has a higher palatability, and our 𝗽𝗫𝘀, as it's alkalized, can match the palatability of a pure brewer's yeast. And then we have our whole cell yeast, the star yeast, which is the product for higher inclusion rates that can play both the nutritional side of providing protein. It's a very palatable product as well. And it also provides, good amounts of beta-glucans and monoligosaccharides.
As a global leader in pet nutrition, ADM is always looking at what's next, taking a forward-looking view of the industry landscape and a comprehensive approach to developing innovative, science-backed foods, treats, and supplements so owners can take a proactive approach to their pet's wellness.
Fantastic. And out of curiosity, do you have people in your organization that can provide technical guidance if pet food companies are interested in including your products to ensure that they're including them at the proper level and that they have the science that you've generated to support the inclusion of those products?
Yes, we do. We have 7 PhDs working with 𝗫𝗫𝘀, and we regularly, do in vivo research with all animal species, including the pet food. And we are here to help the industry. We are very committed to bring value. And that's I think it's important to say that I am a mechanical engineer. What I am doing in this business, I stumbled in the yeast, and so my strategy was just like, if I know nothing, I will try to be as transparent as possible about what I have. So that's the style of 𝗫𝗫𝘀, is to really to try to understand what is our yeast and now what's yeast about, and to try to explain it instead of trying to create stories around the yeast. And many times it makes our life very difficult, because when you try to explain yeast, when you start to explain yeast, you explain all these different aspects, and then usually there is this pushback that, this is too much for one single product. And some companies are being successful by selling the same product with 5 different bags with 5 different colors, because then they explore just one aspect at a time, and then people, it's more that prepared to accept one positive aspect instead of accepting 4 or 5 positive aspects in the same product. But that's us. We try to be as transparent as possible, and we try to really study and communicate what we learned on these studies.
Excellent. So maybe how can everyone get in contact with you and your team if they're interested in exploring your products?
I think that through our website, 𝗫𝗫𝘀𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, or with my email address. Feel free to send directly to me. My name is Glycon, so it's glycon@𝗚𝗍𝒡𝒺𝗀.com.br.
Excellent. Well, you can anticipate, hopefully, a few contacts to explore your products a little more, Glycon. So with that, I think that this is a really interesting overview of the yeast products that 𝗚𝗍𝒄 has and what their potential benefits and points of differentiation are. Thank you so much for sharing those with you. But you have one other aspect that is not yeast related that I would like to really ask you a question regarding here at the end, which is you have been in this industry and working through the yeast business for over 30 years. And that means that you have observed large changes in the industry in particular. First of all, what do you think the most significant changes in the yeast industry have been?
What we see is yeast used to be, there used to be a scarcity on the yeast supply. And now that because of the maturity of the ethanol fermentation, we see more and more yeast in the market. So we see that everybody was curious about the yeast and willing to accept the property of the yeast. But what was on the back of the decision makers that, am I going to be safe? Meaning that, am I going to have my supply? Can I formulate with the yeast? And so this is really changing. We have a growth on the supply of the yeast. So like 𝗚𝗍𝒄, we are growing our production by 10 to 15% every year. And Brazil, the potential here is that we will be producing 500, 600,000 tons of yeast. So we can triple our total production. So the yeast will, the properties of the yeast, they are real. No silver bullet, but they are real. They're real, and we have to combine yeast with other solutions, with other products, in order to create this alternative path to the antibiotics. And I think that the most important change is that more and more the industry can rely on the supply of the yeast, on the regular supply of the yeast, of yeast additives, different yeast products.
Yes, and the sustainability of the supply chain is as important as the sustainability of the environment. So you need to know you can get your ingredients.
Yeah, you touched a very important point. So especially when you look at the yeast coming from the sugarcane fermentation from Brazil, we have to remember that it's a co-product from the ethanol fermentation. The whole system runs, it's self-sufficient on energy. So all these factories, they produce their own steam and their own electricity, and they sell electricity to the grid as well. So they have the yeast produced in Brazil has the lowest possible carbon footprint of the industry. And there is a revolution going on in Brazil, is that now these companies, they are biodigesting the vinassas. That is another co-product that is used as a fertilizer in the field and producing biogas. So very soon, all the trucks, all the tractors that are used on the agriculture side will run on biogas. So no oil, no electricity, no natural gas, no nothing. It's all very sustainable.
Amazing.
So the yeast produced in Brazil will have a very important impact for the industry. I know that companies like Nestlé, Purina, they are committed to reduce their carbon footprint and paying attention and using the Brazilian yeast. It's gonna be one of the ways to go.
Yeah, we all have to look at what the impact of our ingredient selection is on the environment as well, and start taking a really holistic approach to that. And it's not just about animal versus plant-based. It's far more involved in that. And so you give the listeners another thing to consider. So last but not least, my one maybe more professionally focused question would be, do you have any advice for young entrepreneurs who would like to start and grow a business? What's your biggest piece of advice, the most important thing?
It's I like to say that I am pretty much an accident. That there was no plan to do what we did. And I think that what make it possible is just that I really I kept pushing it. It's really about being consistent and being on top of that, and things happen on ways that you will not be able to plan. So when you find a good opportunity, when you find when you find a good opportunity, when you find something that you are having pleasure developing, just don't give up. Because when I was very young, when I was in the beginning, many people was telling me, no, this is no way, this is just a commodity, this is, you're not going to be successful, it's not going to happen. And you just have to keep pushing, so be consistent, don't give up, things happen.
Great advice. Well, with that, Glycon, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and all of your product information with us today, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I know that this is a new podcast, and I wish you a lot of success. Like very much to be here.
Thank you.